It is the autumn of 1888. The air in London's East End is thick, a cold, wet blanket smelling of coal smoke, old rain, and unadulterated fear. You can almost taste it. In Whitechapel, the fog doesn't just hang, it clings to the cobblestones like a second skin, turning every corner into a blind spot. Somewhere in that oppressive, narrow labyrinth, a man's silhouette slips into the mist. There is a quick, terrible silence, followed only by the slow, lonely drip of water from a gas lamp. He leaves behind a body, and the world has been asking the same question for more than a century. Who was he? The whispers grew into legend, and the legend hardened into myth. Decades later, a single black silk shawl surfaced, a relic saved from the darkness, stained and revered, promising to name the nameless. Scientists claimed it held the key, a molecular signature left 137 years ago. Others called it a cruel, beautiful distraction. Tonight we follow the slow, measured beat of boots on the wet stone, not searching for the Ripper's gray, but for the truth he tried to bury. We look beyond the monster to the women he took. We trace the investigation's fatal flaws. We put one contested piece of fabric under the harsh light of modern science. And we ask, has our desperate need to name a ghost blinded us to the very real, very human stories he left behind? To understand the killer, you must first stand where he stood. Whitechapel was not the grand London of history books. It was the city's exhausted, forgotten lung, crammed with the desperate and the displaced. 76,000 souls were compressed into an area less than a square mile. Eastern European families fleeing pogroms, Irish laborers, the chronically ill, and the utterly, totally poor. By day, the streets reeked of manure, rotting produce, and the iron tang of the nearby slaughterhouses, their waste sluicing red into the gutters. By night, the gas lamps offered only brief, stuttering islands of light, and the rats moved through the deeper shadows like liquid ink. Workhouses were full. If you had 4 pennies, you could get a cheap bunk in a doss house. If you had less, you slept standing draped over a rope strung across a communal room. If you couldn't even afford the rope, you walked until dawn, praying to live to see the sun. This was a place where survival was built on a single silent rule: mind your own business. A scream could be misinterpreted as a domestic quarrel. A body at the curb was just another person too poor to be noticed. The press called it the abyss. Charles Booth, the social reformer, mapped it out, shading its streets the deepest black on his atlas, a color for utter misery. The killer descended into this world not as a stranger, but as someone fluent in its rhythms. He knew the gap between police patrols. He knew which blind alleys bled into which dark courts and where the fog liked to sit and never move. In Whitechapel, the hardest thing in the world was to be seen. The easiest thing to do was simply vanish. The world remembers the killer's brand. It is a profound, continuing tragedy that we so often forget their names. Mary Ann Nichols, 43, a mother of 5. Just past midnight on August 31, 1888, she was turned away from a lodging house, short 4 pence. She tried to sound cheerful, pulling her new black velvet bonnet closer. "I'll soon get my DOS money," she said, carrying a small, fragile hope. Hours later, she was found on Bucks Row. Her throat was cut, her body bearing the marks of quick, deliberate cruelty. The blood was still moving when they found her. Mary Ann had once been a daughter, a wife, a mother. Now she was a statistic. Annie Chapman, 47. She remembered what a good life looked like: a working husband, children she loved. Illness and alcohol had taken their toll, but she kept renewing her hope. On September 8th, unsteady and unwell, she left her lodging house. By morning, she was dead in a backyard on Hanbury Street, her body mutilated with a chilling surgical purpose. This death was not just an end. It was a message, written in a language no one wanted to read. Elizabeth Stride, 44, Swedish-born, she possessed a survivor's stubborn faith that tomorrow might be kinder. On September 30th, witnesses saw her laughing with a man on Berner Street. At 1 in the morning, a carter turned into Dutefield's yard. His horse balked at the darkness. Elizabeth lay there, her throat cut, the blood still pumping, but the mutilation was missing. The killer was interrupted. If murder could be a ritual, this one had been broken mid-prayer. Catherine Eddowes left Bishopsgate Police Station just after 1 a.m. that same night, singing softly to herself. "I'll get a fine hiding when I get home," she joked, heading for the place she would never reach. At 1:44 a.m., she lay dead in Mitre Square. Her face was cut. Her body opened and organs were removed with what a surgeon described as significant anatomical knowledge. It was no longer merely killing. It was practice. Mary Jane Kelly, perhaps 25, she carried the faint traces of an education in her voice, a suggestion of better days. On November 9th, the rent collector looked through a broken pane and saw a scene of destruction so complete that even the grainy police photos can still take your breath away. Here, the killer took his time. Hours, perhaps. Here, the ritual reached its terrifying zenith. And then silence. The murders we call the Canonical Five stopped. The killer's horrific genius was not in the violence itself, but in the choreography around it. He chose places with multiple exits. He struck during the narrow, predictable voids between police patrols, 15-minute windows he used as if he held the police timetable in his hand. The work was quick, 5 to 10 minutes from the first cut to the final mutilation. No prolonged fights, no witnesses close enough or brave enough to intervene. He exploited Whitechapel's culture of self-preservation. A man hurrying down a side street was just a man. A couple arguing in a doorway was too common to merit a second look. The killer didn't need brilliance. He only needed to blend in and then walk a little faster. The wound suggested a practiced, methodical hand. Not necessarily a skilled surgeon, but someone comfortable with a sharp implement, capable of moving quickly and with clear intention. There was an escalation, from brutal efficiency to chilling anatomical selection, culminating in the theatrical scene at Miller's Court. Whatever he was doing, he was honing it as he went. And then he vanished. Why? Death, incarceration, or emigration are the clinical answers. The human answer is the most chilling. A killer who simply found another way to live with himself, folding back into the fabric of ordinary life, remembered, if at all, as a quiet man who kept to himself. The investigation was hobbled from the start. 2 police forces, the Metropolitan and the City of London, shared the crime scenes, and the cooperation was strained. The very concept of a serial killer did not exist as a framework. Detectives were trying to describe a storm with no vocabulary for the rain. Inspector Frederick Aberline led the Metropolitan effort with diligence and a gnawing, constant sense that he was a step behind. Thousands of statements were taken, hundreds of suspects were interviewed. Then came the letters, dozens, then hundreds, most of them hoaxes, but one signed Jack the Ripper, giving the killer his terrifying, marketable name. Whether it was a prank or an imposter, the name stuck like a terrible, catchy song lyric. As the bodies mounted, the community's fear curdled into rage. Vigilante groups sprang up. Foreign-looking men were harassed. Jewish immigrants became targets for a rage that simply needed an outlet. After Catherine Eddowes' murder, a chalk message appeared near the scene. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The police commissioner personally ordered it erased, fearing it would spark a riot. The Ripper didn't just kill, he changed the air people breathed. He made trust evaporate. By 1894, a police memorandum named 3 principal suspects, Montague John Druitt, Michael Ostrag, and Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born Jewish hairdresser later committed to an asylum. But without DNA, fingerprints, or even proper blood typing, the evidence was thin. Whitechapel had become a closed theater where the audience was desperate for answers and the stage had nothing left to give. For a century, the case cooled but never died. Then, in 2006, a collector purchased a silk shawl said to have been taken from the Mitre Square scene and passed down through a police officer's family. The shawl bore dark stains consistent with blood and other bodily fluids. The collector wanted a name, and he turned to modern science. Dr. Jerry Luolainen, a molecular biologist, attempted to lift degraded genetic material. What he reported stunned the world. Mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down the maternal line from a bloodstain, matched a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes. More explosively, mitochondrial DNA from semen stains was found to match a living descendant of Kosminski's sister. It wasn't a fingerprint, it wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to crown a suspect in the court of public opinion. At last, the mystery had a name. Again. The skepticism was immediate and unforgiving. Mitochondrial DNA is a family signature, not a personal ID. It tells you the stain was left by someone in that maternal lineage, not that it was Aaron Kosminski himself. Crucially, the shawl's chain of custody was a disaster. A century is a long time. Who handled it? Was it washed, displayed, stored next to other things? No official police record from 1888 mentioned it. The evidence was presented in a book and the media, not in a peer-reviewed scientific journal where data can be challenged. At best, the shawl suggests Catherine Eddowes' blood and a man from Kosminski's family line were both connected to the same piece of fabric. That is not the same as proving murder. If you presented this evidence in a modern court, a good lawyer would dismantle it before the lunch break. And yet, Aaron Kosminski refuses to be a footnote. He lived in Whitechapel. He was 23, local, invisible. He was a hairdresser, accustomed to blades, methodical hands, and precision near flesh. Within a few years of the murders, he was institutionalized, with records noting paranoia and auditory hallucinations. Then there is the quietest clue of all, handwritten notes discovered in the 1980s in former Chief Inspector Donald Swanson's personal memoir. Swanson wrote that the police had identified the killer as a Polish Jew living in Whitechapel, recognized by a witness who refused to testify out of community fear. The suspect was then confined to an asylum. Swanson didn't write Kosminski, but the details align perfectly. Does that make him the Ripper? No, but history is not a courtroom, it is a weighing of probabilities. When historians calculate proximity, means, opportunity, and police impressions, Kosminski scores high. In a case where absolute certainty is forever withheld, most likely begins to feel like the only place we can rest. We cannot close this story by fixing a name to the monster. That is how the legend wins and people vanish. Say their names out loud. Feel the city change around you. Mary Ann Nichols, mother, hopeful, even as her luck ran out. Annie Chapman, sick, stubborn, still bargaining with tomorrow. Elizabeth Stride, laughing with a man in the lamplight moments before the dark turned its face toward her. Catherine Eddowes, singing as she walked into a square that was watching and judging nothing. Mary Jane Kelly, behind a door that should have kept the world out, alone at the edge of mourning. They were not cold unfortunates. They had histories, children, lovers, tempers, and dreams. They lived in a society that condensed a woman's poverty into a moral failing and then blamed them when danger found them in places built to be dangerous. The most honest mirror in the Ripper story is the one that shows how easy it is to let the circumstances of a victim's life mute our outrage at their death. Why does the Ripper endure? Because he is a perfect storm of the Gothic and the modern, a killer who worked in the liminal spaces, between patrol cycles, between alley and avenue, between history and myth. We want to believe that naming a monster gives us power over him, but the greatest revelation is this: the fog has lifted enough for us to see the truth that matters. We may never know who he was, We know who they were. Remember them first, then look up, past the shadows, and promise to build cities where the next person's scream is not mistaken for the night breathing. As the fog of history begins to thin, we must hold on to the names that truly illuminate this story. Say them one last time with the solemn weight of recognition. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. If this chapter of history gave you a clearer view of the human cost and the persistent shadows of Whitechapel, please consider supporting our work. A simple like, subscription, or turning on notifications helps us dedicate the resources needed to continue telling these complex and vital stories with the respect they deserve. We invite you to share your thoughts, reflections, and theories in the comments below. We ask only that you approach this discussion with the same solemn respect due to the victims and their descendants. The search for answers is far from over. If you're ready to continue digging into the later theories and the broader context of Victorian crime, you can tap the screen now. We'll meet you there for the next chapter.